Welcome back to another deep dive, everybody. This time, we're heading over to Nigeria.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah. We're going to explore this really pivotal moment in its history. The June 12, 1993 presidential election. You familiar?
Oh, yes, the June 12th saga.
Exactly, the June 12th saga.
Yeah.
Now, this election, a lot of people considered it free and fair, but get this.
It gets annulled.
Annulled, sparking, all this political turmoil. And that's what you're diving into today.
Wow.
And to help us navigate this, we're going to be using Ibrahim Babangida's own book, A Journey in Service. He was, as a central figure in this whole saga.
Absolutely. He was the one in power at the time, right?
Yes. So we're going to try to really understand his perspective, his motivations, the challenges he faced. It should be fascinating.
I'm really excited to dive into this. Babangida, he came to power in 1985 through a coup, but he wasn't just another military ruler.
Yeah, what set him apart?
He seemed really determined to break that cycle of coups, and actually transition Nigeria to a stable civilian rule, like a real lasting democracy.
Ambitious goal.
Right. And in his book, he reflects on past mistakes, like the handover of power in 1979 under Obasanjo.
Okay, so he's learning from the past, trying to do things differently this time.
Yeah, he lays out a really specific plan for a different, more successful path.
So where does he begin? How does he tackle this massive undertaking?
Well, he starts by, just 5 months into his rule, he establishes something called the Political Bureau. This wasn't just, some small committee. It was huge.
Massive.
Imagine over 27,000 submissions from Nigerians from all over the country. They held public consultations, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. Talk about gathering information.
They were trying to create, a roadmap for a smooth transition. And get this, their recommendations were then passed on to, the Armed Forces Ruling Council.
The AFRC. So that's where the rubber meets the road. They have the final say.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this bureau gathering all this input. What were some of the big, recommendations that the AFRC adopted?
Well, 2 major changes that they really focused on were a 2-party system, right? But also, they banned former politicians for 10 years.
Whoa, a 10-year ban. That's a big statement.
Yeah.
What was the rationale behind that?
Well, some argued it was necessary to kind of break with the past, to let a new breed of politicians emerge.
Yeah, fresh faces, new ideas.
Right, but others, like Chief Obafemi Awolowo, you know him.
Yes, of course.
He protested against the ban pretty strongly. He said it was excluding experienced voices, which is a good point.
A very valid point. So Babangida faced some pushback right from the start.
Oh, absolutely. But he stuck to his guns.
That's quite a gamble, though, right? Barring all these experienced politicians, it could either clear the way for fresh perspectives or, as Chief Awolowo was saying, create this vacuum of leadership.
A total power vacuum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what did he do? What steps did Babangida take to ensure that this so-called new breed was actually ready for the challenge?
He seemed committed to this, really structured step-by-step transition, really deliberate.
Okay.
So in 1988, they inaugurated the Constituent Assembly to review the 1979 Constitution.
All right, so rewriting the rules of the game.
But of course, this process wasn't without its, challenges.
Oh, I'm sure. What kind of challenges did they run into?
Well, one of the biggest ones was this debate about whether or not to include Sharia law in the Constitution.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a huge issue.
It was really divisive, splitting the nation along religious lines.
So balancing competing interests, navigating these long-standing tensions, it sounds incredibly complicated.
It was,
Yeah.
But it wasn't all about the Constitution,
What else did he do?
Babangida, he also set up the Center for Democratic Studies, or CDS. It was meant to educate this new generation of politicians.
Oh, interesting. So not just changing the rules, but actually trying to change the political culture itself.
Yeah, like teaching them about democratic principles, how to govern effectively, that kind of stuff.
Like he was trying to create this whole new political ecosystem.
Exactly. And alongside all of this, they also started holding phased elections, beginning at the local level in December 1987.
Oh, okay. So building up from the ground level.
Yep. Then they moved on to state level in 1990, all building towards this presidential election.
Because it's like this very deliberate step-by-step process. Did he ever, publicly waver on his commitment to actually handing over power?
No, he repeatedly emphasized his commitment to it. It was like the cornerstone of his whole program.
Okay, so we've got this new constitution in the works, these new politicians being groomed, and then there's this 2-party system, which you mentioned earlier. It sounds kind of, artificial.
Yeah, it definitely raised eyebrows. Imagine the AFRC under Babangida decided to create these 2 parties. the Social Democratic Party, SDP, and the National Republican Convention. Yeah, NRC. And Babangida's argument was, well, it was to prevent the kind of ethnic and regional divisions that had, caused problems in the past.
Okay, so he's trying to force unity through this two-party system.
Right. He basically forced all these existing political associations to merge into these two big umbrella parties.
That sounds a bit like, well, like he's picking winners and losers before the game even starts. It seems to kind of contradict the idea of a free and fair democracy, don't you think?
It definitely sparked criticism. Some people saw it as like a blatant attempt to control the political landscape, to limit real competition.
Yeah, that makes sense. How did Babangida respond to that kind of criticism?
He defended it. He said a strong two-party system, at least in his view, was absolutely necessary for national unity and stability.
Okay, so he's prioritizing stability over perhaps a wider range of political voices.
Yeah, especially given Nigeria's diversity. He saw it as essential for holding the country together during this transition.
It's a really interesting argument. So we've got all this going on, the Constitution, the new breed of politicians, this controversial two-party system. I imagine there was a lot of, well, anticipation, excitement, maybe even anxiety building up to this presidential election.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So in 1989, when they finally lift the ban on political activities, things get really interesting.
Okay, like what happens?
All these political associations pop up. Everyone's excited to participate in this new political landscape. It's really dynamic.
So we've got this explosion of political energy.
Exactly. But then the National Electoral Commission, the NEC, they have to narrow down the field.
Oh, right, because of this two-party system.
Right. So first they narrow it down to 6 parties, then they go even further down to those 2 mandated parties, the SDP and the NRC.
Yeah.
And a lot of aspiring politicians are left out in the cold.
That must have been incredibly frustrating for them.
Yeah.
Having their dreams essentially crushed by this system.
Absolutely. A lot of complaints about manipulation, accusations of bias in the selection process.
Right, so even before the election, there's already this sense of tension, maybe even resentment.
Yeah, and all of this is happening against this backdrop of, existing political tensions and anxieties.
It's a very fragile situation.
Very fragile. And then, to make matters even worse, in April 1990, Major Gideon Orkar stages a coup attempt.
Oh, wow, a coup attempt. That must have thrown a wrench in the whole transition program.
It was a huge setback, a stark reminder of just how vulnerable this whole process was, and it raised doubts about whether Babangida could actually pull this off.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if he ever considered just, abandoning the whole thing, going back to the old way.
He could have, easily. But he didn't. He pushed forward. And eventually, we have our 2 contenders emerge from these 2 chosen parties.
All right, so who are they? Who are these 2 figures who are going to go head-to-head in this historic election?
On one side, you have Moshe Dabiola, representing the SDP.
Okay.
And on the other, Bashir Tofa, the candidate for the NRC.
So the stage is set. We have our players. And then, of course, we have the June 12th election itself. What was the atmosphere like on that day?
Well, Babangida had introduced this new voting method called Option A4, and it was actually designed to reduce rigging.
Okay, interesting. So make things more transparent, more fair.
Yeah. And on Election Day, it seemed to work. The election was widely seen as peaceful and fair.
So it seems like everything is going according to plan.
Yeah.
But as we know, this is where the story takes this crazy turn. What happened?
Yeah, so on June 23, 1993, Babangida just drops this bombshell. Citing electoral irregularities and fears of unrest, he just annuls the results.
Just like that, after all this meticulous planning.
Yeah. And it throws the entire nation into this, state of shock and confusion. Protests erupt everywhere.
I can imagine. It's almost like he built this house of cards and then just, blew it all down. It's baffling.
It really is. And especially because he had just introduced Option A4 to make the election fair.
Right. So it makes you wonder, what were his true motives? Was he trying to cling to power? Was he pressured by the military? Or was he genuinely concerned about the country falling apart?
These are questions that continue to be debated today.
It's like a giant question mark hanging over this entire period. It seems like a classic case of a leader making a decision based on what he thinks is best for the country, even if it goes against what the people clearly want. So where do we go from here? How does Nigeria and Babangida himself deal with this aftermath?
Well, that takes us into, this really tumultuous period following the annulment. A period marked by protests, political maneuvering, and the rise of new figures trying to capitalize on the chaos.
Oh, I bet. This sounds like the beginning of a whole new chapter in this saga.
It definitely is. But before we get into that, maybe it's good to just take a moment and reflect on what we've learned so far.
Yeah, good idea. I mean, this is already such a complex and fascinating story. We've got ambition, power struggles, these fragile attempts at building a stable democracy. It's a lot to process.
Right. We see Babangida trying to break with the past, trying to lay this new foundation for Nigeria.
Yeah, but then he makes this decision that seems to contradict everything he's been working towards. It's like he took one step forward and then two steps back.
Exactly. And as we move into the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore those consequences.
The fallout from the annulment, the rise of new players, and how this whole saga shaped Nigeria's future.
It's going to be a wild ride, so buckle up.
We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back, you guys. So before the break, we were talking about that shocking annulment of the June 12th election. After all that planning.
Yeah, and all that buildup, it's crazy to think about.
Right, like Babangida put so much effort into this transition, and then, boom, he just pulls the plug. I'm curious to see how he tries to explain all this in his book.
It's really fascinating, how he tries to unpack this decision and grapple with the consequences. You really get a sense of him wrestling with it all.
Okay, so what reasons does he give? I mean, a lot of people saw this election as being relatively fair, so what's his justification for annulling it?
Well, he insists that it wasn't like this pre-planned thing, He says it was a reaction to all these irregularities he saw and this, potential for violence. And you have to remember, at the time, there were a lot of ethnic and regional tensions in Nigeria.
Yeah, that's true.
And there was this real fear that the election could have, ignited those fault lines.
Okay, so he's saying he made a tough choice to try and prevent things from getting even worse. But wasn't that a risk inherent in any democratic election, especially in a country as diverse as Nigeria?
Yeah, and that's what a lot of his critics pointed out. They argued that his actions actually made the instability worse.
Right, because the annulment led to those huge protests.
Exactly, and it further polarized the country,
Yeah.
It deepened that distrust in the military government.
So it's this weird paradox. He tries to build a stable system, but then makes a decision that throws everything into turmoil.
Yeah, and in the book, it's interesting how he talks about his position within the military,
Oh, like how much power he really had.
Yeah, he suggests that he wasn't exactly calling all the shots, that there were all these factions within the military, all these power dynamics at play.
Oh, wow. So he was trying to manage these internal pressures while also pushing forward with this transition.
Yeah, and he even hints that some in the military were trying to undermine his program from the start.
That's crazy, like working against him behind the scenes.
It definitely makes you question, how viable his transition program really was.
Yeah, did he overestimate his own control over the military?
That's a big question, right? And it's something that people still debate,
All right, was he really committed to democracy? Or was this whole transition just a show?
Exactly. And it's hard to know for sure. What's clear, though, is that this fear of a coup really influenced his thinking.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. He came to power through a coup, so he knew how easily things could change.
Right, and he argues that accepting the election results could have triggered another coup.
So he saw himself as, the only thing standing between Nigeria and chaos.
In a way, yeah. But of course, a lot of Nigerians just saw the annulment as a blatant power grab. He betrayed their trust.
Which is totally understandable.
Right. So how does he address that in the book? Well, he does acknowledge the pain and disappointment he caused. And he admits that failing to secure full military support for the transition was a big mistake.
So he's taking some responsibility.
He is, but at the same time, he still insists he was acting in the best interests of the nation.
Yeah, he's sticking to that line.
It's definitely a nuanced and maybe even contradictory account. It shows just how complex leadership can be, the impossible choices you sometimes have to make.
And it's a reminder that we're only getting one side of the story here. His side.
Right. To really understand the full picture, you'd have to consider other accounts, Talk to the people who lived through it. Read analyses by historians.
Absolutely. History is never simple. It's all about layers of perspective and interpretation.
Yeah, and with the June 12th saga, there are still so many unanswered questions. So many mysteries.
Okay, so we've got Babangida trying to grapple with the fallout from his decision and a nation on edge. What happens next in this whole drama?
Well, things are chaotic. Protests are continuing, the political scene is in shambles, and everyone's calling for Babangida to resign. And this is where a new player enters the scene, the Association for Better Nigeria.
The ABN.
Yep, the ABN. They suddenly appear advocating for, get this, an extension of military rule.
Whoa, that's the opposite of what Babangida was trying to do.
Exactly. And it's still a mystery who these guys were and what they were really after.
Like a secret society pulling strings in the shadows.
Right. Some think they were a front for hardliners in the military, those who oppose the transition.
Okay.
Others think they were just opportunists trying to take advantage of the situation.
Interesting. So how does Babangida deal with this new wrinkle, this ABN group?
He says he was caught off guard at first. Like he thought they were genuine patriots.
He believed them.
Yeah, initially. But as things unfolded, he started to suspect that they were undermining his program.
Like they were trying to sabotage him?
Yeah, and maybe even trying to grab power for themselves.
Wow. So many layers of intrigue here. It's like a political thriller unfolding in real time.
It really is. Babangida describes himself as being caught in the middle of all this, trying to balance these competing interests.
Right, while also trying to prevent the country from imploding.
It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, he's facing these protests, this potential coup threat, and now this shadowy group working against him. It's a tough spot to be in.
Totally. And he realizes he can't hold on to power forever. The pressure is just too much.
So what does he do? How does he try to get out of this mess?
Well, he comes up with a plan, and it's a controversial one.
So what was it? What was this plan he came up with to try and, well, I guess, get himself out of this corner?
Okay, so Babangida decides to create this thing called the Interim National Government.
The ING.
Yeah, exactly. And he presents it as this temporary bridge, between military rule and a civilian government.
Right, so instead of handing power directly to Abiola, who many believe won the election, he creates this ING as like a stopgap.
Exactly. And it was really controversial. I mean, some people saw it as Babangida trying to hold on to some influence, even after stepping down.
Like he was pulling the strings from behind the curtain.
Right. But others criticized it as, totally ignoring the whole democratic process.
Yeah, like he's just delaying the inevitable.
And they had a point. In the book, Babangida defends this ING thing, saying he was trying to prevent, a total collapse of the system.
Okay, so damage control.
Yeah, he says he needed to ensure a smooth transition, prevent more violence.
But creating this ING, wouldn't that just make things more complicated, more confusing?
Yeah, and as it turned out, the ING was really short-lived and not very effective.
Not surprising.
It was full of internal divisions, faced tons of opposition, and just never really gained legitimacy.
Right, because it wasn't a democratically elected government.
Exactly. So even with Babangida stepping down, the crisis continued.
This is crazy. It seems like everything he tried just backfired.
It really did. And this is where we see another figure step in Sani Abacha.
Oh, Abacha, right. He takes over next.
Yeah, he was a powerful general, kind of been lurking in the background this whole time. And on November 17th, 1993, he just seizes power in a coup.
Wow, so another coup. Talk about coming full circle.
Yeah, it was a huge blow to any progress towards democracy. Abacha's rule was, pretty brutal.
Yeah, a dark chapter for sure.
He shut down political parties, silenced dissent, really cracked down on any opposition.
So much for Babangida's vision of a smooth transition to democracy. It's really tragic how it all unfolded.
It is. And this is where we can really understand, the lasting impact of June 12th.
Okay, so what is that legacy? How did these events, all this chaos, how did it shape Nigeria?
Well, for one thing, June 12th became this powerful symbol, of the Nigerian people's desire for democracy.
They never gave up hope.
They didn't. Even though the protests were suppressed, they showed that people were ready for change, that they wouldn't accept this annulment.
It's like it galvanized the pro-democracy
Yeah.
movement, right?
Yeah.
Gave them even more determination.
Yeah, and it inspired future generations. Even though Abacha came in, the spirit of June 12 never really died.
So it planted the seeds for the eventual return to civilian rule in 1999.
Exactly. But June 12 is more than just a symbol,
What do you mean?
It really changed how Nigerians viewed things like democracy, the military's role in politics.
Okay, so June 12 forced them to rethink the whole system.
Yeah. First, it showed that the military wasn't the only answer. Even though Babangida's transition failed, it showed that a peaceful handover of power was possible.
So they saw that there was an alternative to military rule.
Right. And Abacha's regime just reinforced that, People realized that even a flawed democracy was better than a dictatorship.
Yeah, they saw the dangers of military rule firsthand.
And secondly, June 12 showed them the importance of real elections, Elections that actually reflect the will of the people.
Right, because the annulment was based on these flimsy accusations of irregularity.
Exactly. So June 12 exposed the weaknesses in their system. It was like a wake-up call, a catalyst for change.
So it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a turning point.
It was. It made people demand a better system, a more accountable government.
And that struggle continues today, right?
Absolutely. Nigeria's democracy is still young. It faces a lot of challenges.
Yeah, corruption, inequality, all kinds of problems.
But the legacy of June 12 is still there. It continues to inspire people to fight for a better future.
So what can what can our listeners take away from all of this deep dive into this incredibly complex and, well, frankly, dramatic period in Nigerian history?
I think it shows us, how strong the desire for democracy can be.
Yeah, even in the face of setbacks and violence.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And it reminds us that the fight for freedom is never really over,
It's a constant struggle.
and that we have to be vigilant. We have to keep learning from the past, learning from mistakes like the annulment, like Abacha's dictatorship.
Right, because those mistakes have real
They
consequences.
do. But June 12 also gives us hope. It shows that change is possible.
Yeah, and that ordinary people can make a difference.
They can. They can challenge the status quo, demand better from their leaders.
And that's a powerful message, a message that resonates not just in Nigeria, but all over the world.
For sure. Because at the end of the day, this is a story about human rights, about freedom, about the pursuit of a more just and equitable world.
Well said. Well, everyone, that's it for our deep dive into the June 12 saga. It's been a journey, that's for sure.
It has. From Babangida's ambitious plans to the annulment to the rise of Abacha and the enduring legacy of those events.
We've covered a lot of ground today. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, keep those minds curious.
And who knows, maybe this has sparked your interest in other pivotal moments in history. There's a whole world out there waiting to be discovered.
Until next time, keep diving deep, folks.